It wasn't a big lie, not the kind people imagine when they think of something that could unravel a life. It didn't arrive with urgency or pressure. It came quietly, in a calm moment where nothing seemed out of place, where the setting felt stable and predictable, and Sabastian Hubert stood in that moment with a choice that did not appear significant. A simple decision between telling the truth and choosing a version of it that felt easier to say. And at the time, the difference between those two options did not seem like something that would carry weight beyond that conversation. Because the intention behind it was not to harm anyone. It was to avoid conflict, to smooth over a situation that might otherwise become complicated, and in that sense, it felt justified. It felt controlled, and most importantly, it felt temporary, as if the truth could always be addressed later when the moment was more convenient. And so he made the choice that many people would recognize, the one that resolves discomfort in the present without fully considering what it might create in the future. And for a while, everything continued exactly as expected. There were no immediate consequences, no visible signs that anything had changed. The people around him responded as they always had. The routine held steady, and the decision he made seemed to settle into the background, becoming just another detail in a sequence of ordinary events. But what Sabastian Hubert did not see at the time was how that single statement began to alter the way information moved around him, how it shifted perceptions in subtle ways, creating a version of events that others accepted as real. And once that version took hold, it began to interact with situations he could not anticipate, leading to outcomes that no longer aligned with what he originally intended. And as time passed, small inconsistencies started to emerge, not enough to raise immediate alarm, but enough to create questions that could not be easily answered within the framework of what he had said. And those questions began to build, connecting with each other in ways that made the original lie more difficult to maintain, because each new situation required him to reinforce it, to adjust it, to ensure that it remained consistent with everything that followed. And in doing so, the control he believed he had over the situation started to shift. Because the lie was no longer something he could contain, it had become part of a larger sequence that continued to develop whether he intended it to or not. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what follows is not just a story about dishonesty. It is about how a single moment, one sentence spoken under the belief that it would resolve a problem, can begin to influence everything around it in ways that are not immediately visible, and how those influences can grow until they reach a point where they can no longer be managed. And as the situation surrounding Sabastian Hubert moved toward that point, the tension that had been building beneath the surface finally began to show itself, not gradually, but in a way that forced everything into the open at once, bringing with it consequences that extended far beyond the original decision. Because by the time everything came out, by the time the truth began to surface in ways he could no longer control, it was no longer about the lie itself. It was about everything it had set in motion. Sabastian Hubert lived within a structure that depended on consistency, a balance between his professional responsibilities and his personal life, where trust was not just expected, it was assumed. And within that environment, the version of events he had created with that single decision began to settle into place, shaping how others understood him and the situation he was part of. And that is where the central questions begin to form, because understanding what happened next requires looking beyond the surface and into the foundation of that lie. What exactly did Sabastian Hubert say? What was the statement that seemed small enough to pass without consequence, but precise enough to influence everything that followed? And once that question is considered, it leads to another that is more difficult to answer. Why did he tell it? Because lies are rarely isolated from context. They are often tied to pressure, to perception, to the need to maintain a certain image or avoid a certain outcome. And in Sebastian's case, the motivation behind his choice becomes just as important as the choice itself. because it reveals the conditions that made the truth feel less accessible in that moment. And as the sequence continues, a third question begins to take shape, one that defines the direction of the entire story. How did it spiral into something bigger? How did a single statement evolve into a series of consequences that extended far beyond its original purpose? Because what follows is not immediate. It develops through interactions, through interpretations, through the way others respond to what they believe to be true. And as those responses accumulate, they begin to create a version of reality that moves independently of the original intention. And this is where the story shifts from a simple act of dishonesty into something far more complex. Because this isn't just about a lie being told. It is about how that lie begins to influence everything around it, how it quietly reshapes relationships, expectations, and outcomes in ways that are not immediately visible, and how, over time, those changes reach a point where they can no longer be contained or corrected, because this is not just a story about dishonesty. It is about how one lie can quietly rewrite everything around it. To understand why Sabastian Hubert made the choice he did, you have to look at the life he had built before that moment, because nothing about him suggested someone who would willingly create a situation that could spiral beyond his control. He was in his late 40s, responsible, respected, and known for being dependable in both his professional and personal life. The kind of person others relied on because he rarely allowed problems to surface without attempting to resolve them first. And that reliability was reinforced by the environment he operated in, a structured routine that balanced his career with a family life built on trust, where expectations were clear and stability was maintained through consistency. And for a long time, that system worked in his favor. It allowed him to manage responsibilities without drawing attention to the pressures that existed beneath the surface. But those pressures were there, building gradually in ways that were not immediately visible to those around him. Financial concerns that required careful handling, work-related demands that carried their own level of strain, and an emotional weight that came from trying to keep everything aligned without allowing anything to fall out of place. And within that context, Sabastian developed a pattern that felt effective in the short term, but carried long-term implications. He avoided difficult conversations when possible, choosing instead to manage issues quietly, to resolve them in ways that did not disrupt the stability he had worked to maintain. And this approach often involved small omissions, details left unspoken not because they were intended to deceive, but because addressing them directly would have introduced complications he believed he could avoid. And over time, those omissions became part of how he navigated challenges, reinforcing the idea that problems could be controlled without fully confronting them. And while that belief held under certain conditions, it also created a foundation where the line between managing a situation and misrepresenting it became less defined. And that is where the foreshadowing of what followed becomes clear, not through one significant event, but through a series of small choices that reduced the likelihood of direct confrontation, each one reinforcing the idea that maintaining control was more important than addressing discomfort. And as those patterns settled into place, they shaped how Sabastian Hubert responded when he faced a moment that required a clear decision, because by then, the habit of choosing the easier path had already been established. And in that moment, when the truth presented itself as something that might disrupt the balance he was trying to maintain, he responded in the way he had conditioned himself to respond, not by confronting it directly, but by adjusting it just enough to keep everything in place. And then, without fully recognizing the impact it would have, Sabastian Hubert told a lie that seemed harmless. The moment Sabastian Hubert chose to speak, the lie itself did not stand out as anything dramatic. It was delivered calmly, measured in a way that aligned with everything people expected from him. And that was precisely what made it effective, because it did not raise suspicion, it did not invite immediate questions. It fit seamlessly into the situation it was meant to resolve, and in that moment, it achieved exactly what he intended. It closed a gap, removed tension, and allowed everything to continue without disruption, whether it was about where he had been, a decision he had made, or an interaction he chose not to fully explain. The detail he altered was small enough to be accepted without resistance, and for a short time, that acceptance created a sense of relief. Because the problem appeared contained, the conversation moved forward, and the stability he had worked to maintain remained intact. But that sense of resolution was temporary, because once the lie became part of the narrative others believed, it began to interact with new situations. And in those situations, small inconsistencies started to emerge, details that did not fully align with what had been said, moments where the sequence of events required clarification. And at first, those inconsistencies were subtle, easy to dismiss or reinterpret, but they did not disappear. They accumulated, and as they did, Sabastian found himself needing to reinforce what he had already said, not in a way that felt like a deliberate escalation, but in a way that felt necessary to maintain consistency. Each adjustment building on the last, each explanation requiring another layer to ensure everything continued to make sense. And as that process continued, the original lie became less isolated and more integrated into a broader framework of statements that all depended on each other to remain intact. And this is where the control he believed he had began to shift, because the more the situation expanded, the more variables entered into it. And with those variables came the possibility of contradiction, and that possibility eventually became reality, because at a certain point, something introduced a discrepancy that could not be easily explained, whether it was evidence that did not align, a witness who provided a different account, or a simple contradiction that disrupted the sequence he had constructed. And when that happened, the structure he had been maintaining began to weaken, not all at once, but enough to make it clear that it could no longer hold without strain. And in that moment, as he recognized the shift from control to uncertainty, Sabastian Hubert understood something that had not been apparent when he first made the decision, that the situation had moved beyond his ability to manage it, and that the lie he once believed he could contain had become something that was now shaping the outcome on its own. And that's when he realized he wasn't controlling the lie anymore. The shift did not happen all at once. It began with a question, then another, and before long the certainty that had once surrounded Sabastian Hubert started to give way to suspicion, because the contradiction that surfaced could not be easily dismissed. It demanded explanation, and when that explanation did not come in a way that aligned with what others were beginning to observe, the tone of every interaction around him changed. What had once been accepted without hesitation was now examined more closely. And that examination led to confrontation, direct questions that forced Sabastian to revisit the version of events he had constructed. And in those moments, his responses, though consistent with what he had already said, no longer carried the same level of trust, because doubt had already entered the situation, and once doubt is present, even the most confident explanation can begin to feel incomplete. And as that doubt spread, the perception of Sabastian Hubert shifted in a way that was difficult to reverse, moving from someone who was trusted and dependable to someone whose actions required verification. And within that shift, the situation expanded beyond personal interaction into a broader investigation, involving not just those closest to him, but also others connected through his work and responsibilities, each attempting to reconstruct the timeline, to understand what had happened and where the inconsistencies originated. And as this process unfolded, different interpretations began to emerge, some suggesting that another individual might be involved, offering an alternative explanation that could account for the discrepancies without placing full responsibility on Sabastian. Others proposing that the situation was being misinterpreted, that the events themselves were more complex than they appeared, and that the contradictions were the result of incomplete information rather than deliberate action. And within these possibilities, partial truths surfaced, details that aligned with certain aspects of the story but failed to explain it entirely, creating a landscape where multiple explanations coexisted without any one of them fully resolving the situation. And as the investigation deepened, the tone of questioning became more direct, more focused on intent rather than circumstance. Why didn't you tell the truth? What were you trying to hide? Questions that moved beyond the specifics of the event and into the reasoning behind Sebastian's choices. And in facing those questions, he encountered a different kind of pressure, one that was not external alone but internal, because the narrative he had maintained began to conflict with the reality being uncovered, creating a tension between what he remembered, what he had said, and what was now being revealed. And this tension made it increasingly difficult for him to maintain a clear distinction between the original decision and everything that followed, because the lie had been repeated, adjusted, and reinforced to the point where it had become part of how he understood the situation himself. And as that understanding began to unravel, so did his sense of control, because each new piece of information introduced a possibility that he had not accounted for. And just as it seemed that the investigation was moving through a series of interpretations without reaching a definitive conclusion, a piece of evidence surfaced that did not fit within any of the existing explanations, something that connected the events in a way that had not been previously considered. And when that evidence was brought into focus, it shifted the entire direction of the investigation, because it revealed a detail that could not be ignored, and in doing so, it changed everything. The piece of evidence that surfaced did more than clarify a detail. It connected the entire sequence in a way that made the underlying structure impossible to ignore, because when it was placed alongside everything that had already been uncovered, it revealed that the lie Sabastian Hubert told was not confined to that initial moment. It had acted as the starting point of a chain reaction, one that influenced how others interpreted events, how decisions were made in response to those interpretations, and how situations developed based on information that was never accurate to begin with. And as investigators followed this chain, tracing how one assumption led to another, the scope of the situation expanded beyond what Sebastian had intended or even imagined, because the consequences that emerged were not direct results of the lie itself, but of the actions people took based on what they believed to be true. And in that sense, the situation had evolved independently, shaped by a version of reality that existed only because it had been accepted without question. And this is where the most difficult realization begins to take form, because it shows that the escalation was not the result of a single act, but of a series of responses that built upon each other, each one reinforcing the original statement until it became the foundation for decisions that carried real impact. And as this understanding became clear, it introduced a deeper layer to the story, one that shifted the focus away from the lie itself and toward the belief it created, because the real damage did not come from what Sebastian said in isolation. It came from how that statement altered the way others perceived the situation, how it influenced their actions, and how those actions produced outcomes that could not be undone. And when the truth was finally brought into full view, when the original sequence was reconstructed without the distortion created by the lie, the contrast between what had been believed and what had actually occurred became undeniable. And in that moment, the weight of Sabastian Hubert's decision could no longer be separated from its consequences, because it was clear that he had not just altered a detail, he had changed the framework through which everything was understood. And as that realization settled in, defining the emotional core of the entire case, it became evident that he didn't just lie, he changed what everyone believed was real. By the time the truth surrounding Sabastian Hubert was fully revealed, it did not arrive as a sudden moment of clarity. It unfolded in a way that forced every part of the situation into the open, piece by piece, until there was no version of events left to maintain except the one that had been there from the beginning. And as that reality became public, the impact was immediate. not just in how the situation was understood, but in how Sebastian himself was perceived, because the trust that had once defined his relationships could not be restored in the same way once it had been broken. And within that shift, the consequences extended beyond the facts of what had happened, reaching into the personal and professional spaces he had spent years building. Because the same reliability that had once been associated with him was now questioned, and the stability he had maintained was replaced by uncertainty. And while the truth provided answers, it did not undo the outcomes that had already taken place. It did not reverse the decisions others had made based on what they believed, and it did not restore the connections that had been affected by the sequence of events. And in that sense, the resolution was not defined by closure, but by the recognition of what could not be returned to its previous state. And for Sabastian Hubert, that recognition carried a weight that extended beyond the situation itself, because it required him to confront not only the lie he told, but the chain of consequences that followed from it. And as that understanding settled in, the central realization of the story became clear, not as a statement of fact, but as a reflection on how easily a single decision can evolve into something far greater than its origin. Because one lie does not stay one lie. It interacts with everything around it. It shapes perceptions, influences actions, and creates outcomes that continue long after the original moment has passed. And within that realization is a broader perspective on the role of truth and its absence. Because the truth does not always destroy things. Sometimes it is the absence of it, the decision to replace it with something more convenient, that creates the conditions for everything to fall apart. And as the story reaches its conclusion, it leaves behind a question that does not belong solely to Sabastian Hubert, but to anyone who has ever faced a moment where honesty carried a cost. Because if telling the truth would have caused pain in that moment, if it would have disrupted what felt stable and manageable, would you still have told it, knowing what might follow? Or would you have made the same choice, believing that the consequences could be controlled? And after everything Sabastian Hubert experienced, every decision, every consequence, and every moment where the truth could have taken a different path, the story no longer belongs only to him. It becomes a reflection that extends to you. Because situations like this are rarely defined by obvious choices. They are shaped by moments that feel manageable at the time. Moments where the line between honesty and self-protection is not as clear as it seems. And that is where the real question begins. Because if you were in Sabastian Hubert's position, standing in that same moment where telling the truth might have created immediate discomfort, where it might have disrupted what felt stable, would you have chosen to be honest? Or would you have protected yourself in the way he did, believing that the outcome could still be controlled? And as you consider that, another question emerges, one that goes beyond the decision itself and into the structure of what followed. What do you think really caused everything to fall apart? Was it the lie alone? Or was it the way that lie shaped the actions and beliefs of everyone around him, creating a version of reality that moved further away from the truth with every step? And within that perspective, there is a deeper question that challenges how we define the impact of our choices. Because when does a lie stop being small? At what point does something that feels minor begin to influence outcomes in ways that can no longer be contained? Because the answer is not always immediate, and it is often only visible in hindsight, when the sequence has already unfolded. So take a moment to reflect on it and share your perspective, because every viewpoint adds another layer to understanding how these situations develop. And if stories like this make you question the decisions you make, the truths you tell, and the moments where you choose one over the other, then subscribe to Unseen Mind Lab for more stories that reveal what the mind tries to hide.